Hi, folks. Hope you're keeping well. Well, there's a lot of big changes happening in my life, and most specifically, I'm about to start a new academic year, and I'm starting an academic year in a new job. I'm starting work at the University of Toronto Jazz Studies program as assistant professor of jazz starting this fall, starting in a few days, actually, as I record this. And I'm really excited about the new chapter in my life, and also with the new year dawning. A lot of students often come to me with the question about repertoire. And I have to contend with this quite frequently in my professional life. Learning new tunes and learning tunes from the standard repertoire is something that every jazz musician has to do, regardless of your instrument. So I thought I would make a video explaining my process very briefly, very succinctly, but it's going to be a little bit off the cuff, talking about how I go about learning material, learning the melody, learning the harmony, learning all those other things in between that relate to the song, and thinking about this in a way that hopefully is going to help the tune stick with me for the longest amount of time possible. In the so-called jazz canon, there are hundreds of compositions, and so it can be a little bit overwhelming and a bit daunting for students and also for seasoned people who have been around and doing it for a while. So I thought I would make this video to address these concerns, and I hope you get a lot from it. If you have further questions, if I'm glossing over something or if I'm just not getting into as much detail as you would like, please let me know in the comments and I'll do my best to help you further. The first question that you may be asking yourself watching this video is, okay, so we're talking about jazz standard repertoire. What do you mean by learning repertoire? What defines learning to you? Well, there's a few things that define the learning. The degree to which you know the melody of a song, the harmony of a song, the form of a song, perhaps the backstory of a song, the lyrics of a song. These are all aspects of music within this canon of compositions that I think is really, really important to understand. As a saxophone player within jazz ensembles, I'm often playing the melody, and I'm not playing the harmony unless I'm playing in a more of an arranged context. But for myself, I feel it really important to understand the context of a tune really deeply, to the point where I know all the changes of the tune, I know the form of the tune, I know the rhythmic structure of a tune, I know where the accents are, all those little fine details that you might be more expecting to hear a drummer or a piano player or a bass player to know. I feel the responsibility to know those elements as well. So I try to learn them as best as I can. So a little quick story before we get started. When I was a student in music school, I graduated from Humber College in Toronto in 2002, a long time ago, and part of the exit exam to get your degree was a jury, which is essentially a very intense playing test. In my case, it took about an hour, and they had a list of 100 jazz standard compositions that we had to learn, to the point of being able to play the melody, take a solo, be able to demonstrate our knowledge of the chord progression and the rhythm and the harmony and the form and all those things. And it was intimidating at first, but I've often used that experience as a jumping off point for a lot of my students. Because at the end of the day, that list of 100 tunes, which I don't seem to have anymore, but I can imagine most of the tunes in my head, were really only in about 4 or 5 different categories. And this is something that I want to stress. I think to be a better learner of the jazz standard repertoire, you really need to know some compositions from these different categories of works that have come along since the beginning of this canon in roughly the 1920s, 30s. And here's what I think they are. The first is blues, the 12-bar blues, the minor blues, blues with a bridge, things like that. The second category is tunes that are in AABA types of form, like I Got Rhythm, probably the most common type of jazz standard composition after the blues. Just as common as AABA form tunes, you have tunes like ABAC form tunes. For example, Donna Lee, the song which you just heard at the beginning of this video. Next is modal compositions, tunes like So What, Little Sunflower by Freddie Hubbard. Lots of tunes like that that tend to stay in one particular position harmonically and stay there for a long time. You wouldn't necessarily call those songs that are in a key. And the final category of pieces is songs that don't fit any of those other four categories at all. Oftentimes we'll call those non-functional compositions. That is, songs that have their kind of own harmonic logic, and they bounce around from tonal center to tonal center very quickly. It's really hard to pin them down into a major or minor key or call them blues influence compositions. So it's almost the none of the above category, but non-functional harmony is a term that we often use to describe those compositions. It's probably no surprise for you to hear that the first thing that I always recommend that you do to learn jazz standard repertoire is to listen. You must listen to excellent versions of the composition that you're trying to learn. Preferably one of two types of compositions. One, if you can find a recording with the composer of the tune performing it, that's really great because you get a sense as to how it began. Sometimes jazz standards change over time when different people reinterpret them, rearrange them, reharmonize them, may change the melody. Miles Davis famously did that with a lot of Thelonious Monk's compositions, for instance. The other thing that you can do, of course, is find a recording with a singer. If it's a tune that has lyrics, of course, find a recording with a singer. So many of the tunes in this canon of repertoire come from popular songs of the day and Broadway musicals. If you can find a recording with a singer, learn a little bit about the composition that way. Even if I'm going to be performing a tune instrumentally, I want to know what that backstory is. It's really critical for me to understand the emotional backstory of the piece. If you dig deep enough, too, with a lot of instrumental compositions, you will find some neat little bits of backstory that are quite interesting. Over the years, this composition, Donna Lee, that you heard at the beginning of the video, was originally credited to Charlie Parker, but later was attributed to Miles Davis via a variety of different sources. Interesting little tidbits like that might inform your performance of the piece and your ability to just keep it in your head, because now all of a sudden there's a personal connection with the people who wrote it rather than it just being a set of notes. Once you've listened really intently and repeatedly to some great versions of this tune that you're trying to learn, the next step that I generally do is try and sing along with the recording to the point where I can effortlessly sing the recording without having to think too much about it. It should feel very natural. What I'm going for is the spirit of the composition. Sometimes if it's a really super fast melody with tons of chromaticism, I will slow the recording down just so I can sing it accurately. But really what I'm going for is a sense as to how the notes sound, how the accents are placed, where are the peaks and valleys in terms of dynamics in the melody. All of that is what I'm trying to capture with my voice as I'm trying to learn the tune. Once I've done all of that, I'll then go to my instrument. Usually in my case, I actually go to the piano first before I go to the saxophone, just so I can play it in a concert pitch. And that's really important to me because then I can start to learn all the different aspects of the tune, melody and harmony, before going to the saxophone. But if you're just a saxophone player or a woodwind player and you don't play a chordal instrument, I think it's probably time at that point to go to your instrument and start to learn it there. But I always recommend starting with a chordal instrument like the piano first so that you can get a sense as to the whole picture of how the tune fits into all these different other things. The next thing I generally try to do when I'm learning a tune is to learn how to play a bass line on the tune. And this gives me a sense not just of how the chords sound and how the roots sound and the thirds and the sevenths and all those important notes, but how the chords move from point A to point B to point C. What chords exist at the beginning and at the end of each section of the form? What's the beginning of the bridge, if there is a bridge? How does it relate to the global picture of the harmony? So if you're not a bass player and you haven't studied bass lines, here's a couple of quick tips. At the very least, try playing or singing a bass line that is only the roots of the chord progression. Only the roots. Then try building up a simple bass line that's in half notes, if we're talking about a 2-feel bass line in 4/4 time, that is essentially chord tones, usually roots, thirds, fifths, and sevenths. The roots and the fifths are the strongest notes that you can play in a 2-feel bass line. If you're good at that, If that's something that's easy for you, the next step that I generally get to, that I just demonstrated at the beginning of the video, was a 4-field bass line. And I'm not going to break this down for you in any glorious amount of detail, because in general, it follows the same principles that most bass players would probably think about if they're going to make a decent 4-field bass line. Essentially, what I'm doing is playing the root at the beginning of every bar, and then using a combination of chord tones, scales, arpeggios, and a little bit of chromaticism from time to time to get smoothly from one chord tone to the other, or from one root to the other. So I've learned the melody, I've learned the bass line, and the last thing that I typically tend to do to feel like I have a good understanding of the tune is to learn the chord movement at the piano by very simply using guide tone lines. If you're not familiar, guide tone lines are the thirds and the sevenths of the chords typically. And when we play them at the piano or guitar, another chord comping instrument, those musicians tend to find ways to smoothly lead the thirds and the sevenths through each part of the chord progression, usually using stepwise movement, common tones, and inversions. And these guide tone lines help to give us the sound of the chord, but also guide us through the progression in a really smooth musical way. So once I've done all those different steps that I've mentioned to you earlier, learning the melody, learning the bass line, learning the harmony, learning the backstory if there is one, I feel like I have a good handle on the song and that it's going to stick with me for quite a while. But if I really want to challenge myself, I will try to learn a song in 12 keys as much as I possibly can. I don't get to do this with every composition, but I highly recommend that you do this with at least one song in the different categories that I mentioned to you earlier: blues, AABA, etc. There are many different ways to do this, but at the very least, if you know the song by ear, if you've got it so locked in from listening to the recordings and singing it and imitating it well, then hopefully changing keys as an instrumentalist will be something that you can do by ear, slowly maybe, without having to read it or use technology to help you get to that point. Your ear should be able to tell you once you've gotten started whether you're playing things melodically correctly in the key or not. So that's something that I recommend as a final sort of challenge step. I use this particular technique as a warm-up with Donna Lee all the time. In fact, to use some of the tech tools that we have available, but not as a crutch, I use iReal Pro, which is a wonderful piece of software that a lot of my students and colleagues use, to create a very simple bass line that goes through all 12 keys in a row. So that's my process in a nutshell. It's fairly straightforward, but it does take time and a lot of effort to get going with. The more that you do it, the faster and easier it will be. And if you have questions about my process, please let me know in the comments and I'll be happy to answer them. I'm also working on some video ideas to address situations where, as an improviser or as a jazz player, you're presented with new material that hasn't been recorded yet, or is not a standard composition, or doesn't follow the kinds of categorizations that I talked about in the video. So we'll see what happens with that. But in the meantime, happy practicing, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks, everybody.